I practiced the confession in my head 100 times before I said it out loud. Tears, shouting, a slammed door. That's what cheating stories are supposed to look like. But when I finally told my husband the truth that I had an affair, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't ask how long. He didn't even ask why. He just sat there on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I made a mistake." He looked at me then, not with anger, not with pain, with something far worse, distance. That night, he turned off the lamp, lay beside me, and faced the wall. He never touched me again. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not the next year. At first, I thought it was temporary. A punishment. A phase. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. We became experts at pretending. Friends called us the perfect couple. Family said we aged beautifully together. No one knew that inside our home, affection had died quietly and intentionally. 18 years passed like that, until a routine post-retirement physical exam changed everything. And one question from a doctor exposed a truth I was never meant to know. I waited for the punishment to begin. That's the strange thing about guilt, it wants consequences. It needs them. Silence feels unnatural when you've done something unforgivable. The morning after my confession, I woke up before him. I watched his back rise and fall under the blankets, steady, controlled. No anger. No confrontation. In the kitchen, I made coffee the way I always had, 2 cups, 2 spoons of sugar in his, 1 in mine. When I placed his mug in front of him, our fingers brushed for half a second. He pulled his hand back instantly, not violently, carefully. "I'll be late today," he said, his voice neutral, professional, like a coworker giving a schedule update. That was it. No, we need to talk. No, how could you do this? No slammed doors. And somehow that hurt more than shouting ever could. Days passed. Then weeks. We still lived together. Ate at the same table. Slept in the same bed. But a thin, invisible wall existed between us, stronger than concrete. I tried everything. I apologized again. And again. I cried. I touched his arm once while he was watching TV. He froze. Slowly, gently, he moved my hand away, like you would move something fragile you didn't want to break or feel. "Please don't," he said quietly. Not angry. Just final. That was the moment I understood something terrifying. He wasn't punishing me. He had detached from me. At work, people noticed how calm he was. "How do you stay so composed?" Someone once asked him at a dinner party. He smiled politely. "You get used to disappointment." I laughed with everyone else, my stomach twisting. At night, I lay inches away from the man I had betrayed, listening to his breathing, wondering what hurt more, being hated or being erased. I told myself this was temporary. That time would soften him. That love would return if I waited long enough. What I didn't realize was that my husband had made a decision that very first night. A quiet one, a permanent one, and he was executing it perfectly. By the end of the first year, we had mastered the art of looking married to the world while being strangers in private. And that was only the beginning of the 18-year sentence neither of us ever spoke about. By the third year, the silence had developed rules, unspoken ones. We no longer asked each other how our day went. We no longer shared news first. We no longer touched, not accidentally, not out of habit. Our house ran like a well-managed office. He woke up at 6 a.m. sharp. I learned to schedule my mornings around his routine. If he entered a room, I exited. If I was already there, he acknowledged me with a nod, nothing more. No eye contact longer than necessary. At first, I counted the days. Then the months. Eventually, I stopped counting altogether. What terrified me most wasn't his coldness. It was how normal it began to feel. We attended weddings together, smiling for photos. We hosted dinners where he played the perfect husband, pulling out chairs, pouring wine, telling jokes. The moment the last guest left, the performance ended. One night after a charity event, I made a mistake. We were getting ready for bed when I said, casually, "Do you remember our first apartment?" He paused for a second. "Just one." "No," he replied without turning around. That was a lie, and we both knew it. He remembered everything. He simply chose not to share memories with me anymore. That realization crushed me more than his silence ever had. Sometimes I caught him watching me, not with longing, not with resentment, but with something analytical, as if he were observing a case study he already understood. I started having nightmares. In them, I screamed at him, begged him to yell back at me, to feel something. But even in my dreams, he never raised his voice. At year 7, I suggested counseling. He looked up from his newspaper, calm as ever. "I don't see a problem," he said. "Do you?" I didn't answer. Because admitting the problem out loud would mean admitting that this hollow marriage was my fault. By year 10, friends stopped asking why we didn't have children. By year 12, I stopped asking myself. Then, on our 15th anniversary, he left a small box on the dining table. Inside was a bracelet. Simple, elegant, expensive. No card, no explanation. That night, as I fastened it around my wrist, I realized something chilling. This wasn't indifference. This was control. And I was living inside a punishment designed to look like forgiveness. Silence ages people differently. For him, it sharpened something inside, made him precise, contained, almost flawless. For me, it hollowed everything out. By year 16, I could predict his movements without looking. The sound of his keys. The exact second he turned off the hallway light. The way he cleared his throat before speaking to anyone, including me. We spoke only when required. Logistics. Schedules. Public appearances. Never emotions. Never the past. Never us. I began to notice things I hadn't before, details I'd been too busy drowning in guilt to see. He kept journals now. Locked ones. He started running every morning, rain or shine, as if training for endurance rather than health. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing people, studying reactions. And sometimes I saw something flicker across his face. Not pain. Satisfaction. That realization scared me. One night, after almost 18 years of marriage without intimacy, I accidentally cut my finger while cooking. It wasn't serious, but it bled more than I expected. He was in the room. He watched the blood drip onto the counter. Didn't move. Didn't offer help. After a few seconds, he said calmly, "There's a bandage in the second drawer." Then he walked away. I stood there shaking, realizing something unbearable. If I collapsed in front of him, he would call an ambulance. But he would never hold me. That was when the full weight of it hit me. This wasn't forgiveness delayed. This was a life sentence. The bracelet he'd given me years earlier suddenly felt heavy on my wrist, less like a gift, more like a reminder. A marker, a symbol of ownership without affection. At night, I wondered if he ever thought about touching me, or if denying me had become easier than hating me. I stopped trying, stopped hoping, stopped imagining a different ending. And that's when everything shifted, because people who stop hoping become dangerous to themselves. And I had no idea that my quiet resignation was exactly what he had been waiting for. By the time people started calling our marriage inspiring, I had learned how to smile without feeling anything at all. "You two are goals," a woman once said at a dinner party, squeezing my hand. So solid. So calm. Calm. That word followed us everywhere. At family gatherings, he stood beside me with effortless grace, arm hovering just close enough to look intimate, never touching. He opened doors, remembered birthdays, sent flowers on anniversaries. Everyone saw devotion. No one saw deprivation. What they didn't know was that the man they admired hadn't kissed his wife in nearly 2 decades. I played my part perfectly. I laughed when expected. I nodded when praised. I deflected personal questions with humor. At night, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how long a human being could survive without being wanted. The answer, apparently, was a lifetime. The truth revealed itself slowly, in fragments. I noticed how he thrived in public, how respected he became at work. Promotions came easily. People trusted him, confided in him. He had turned emotional restraint into a weapon. Meanwhile, I was shrinking. I stopped buying clothes meant to be seen, stopped wearing perfume, stopped looking at myself in mirrors for too long. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I came across a document I didn't recognize, a copy of our marriage certificate. Behind it, another file, medical articles, highlighted sections, notes in his handwriting, topics like emotional deprivation and control, long-term psychological consequences of intimacy withdrawal, guilt-based compliance in relationships. My hands trembled. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't passive. This was studied, planned, executed. He hadn't stayed because he loved me. He had stayed because leaving would have freed me, and freedom was the one thing he never intended to give back. That night, I looked at him across the dinner table and saw him clearly for the first time, not as my husband, but as a man who had built an entire life around a single silent act of revenge. And the most terrifying part? He was winning. Survival changes the stories you tell yourself. I told myself he stayed because he was loyal. I told myself silence was better than violence. I told myself I deserved this. That last lie was the easiest to believe. I began constructing a version of reality where I wasn't a prisoner, I was a volunteer, where endurance was strength, and suffering was proof of character. If I could just be better, maybe something would change. So I reinvented myself. I joined committees, volunteered at hospitals, became the woman everyone described as so composed. Inside, I was rehearsing escape fantasies I knew I'd never act on. I thought if I reclaimed parts of myself, my independence, my usefulness, I could regain some power. I was wrong. He noticed everything. When I came home later than usual, he didn't ask where I'd been. When I started dressing sharper, he didn't comment. When I began laughing more around others, he observed quietly. Then one evening, without looking up from his book, he said, "You seem happier lately." It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. That night, I couldn't sleep. My heart raced with a realization I had been avoiding. He wasn't ignoring me. He was monitoring me. Every adjustment I made, every attempt at self-preservation, was being logged somewhere in that calm, meticulous mind of his. The next week, I received a call from a volunteer coordinator. "I'm sorry," she said hesitantly, "but we're restructuring. Your position is being dissolved." The same thing happened at another place. Then another. Coincidence, I told myself, until I overheard him on the phone one evening. "Yes," he said calmly. "She won't be a problem. I've handled it." I stood frozen in the hallway. He ended the call and noticed me standing there. For a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, his mask slipped. Not anger, not panic, amusement. That was when I understood the full truth. This wasn't about punishment anymore. This was about ownership. And I was living inside a system designed to make sure I never forgot who controlled the silence. Retirement was supposed to be quiet, predictable, safe. That's what he had planned for, years of routine, control, and carefully measured distance. A life where nothing unexpected could touch him. But retirement changed the rhythm of the house. Suddenly, he was always there. No office to retreat to, no meetings to disappear into, no colleagues to admire his restraint. Just me. At first, he treated it like an extended weekend, early mornings, structured schedules, long walks. But something subtle shifted. He began noticing things he hadn't needed to before. My silences, My exhaustion. The way I flinched when he entered a room too quietly. One morning, I found him standing in the kitchen, staring at me longer than usual. "You've aged," he said flatly. There was no cruelty in his voice, just observation. I wanted to scream, to remind him why. Instead, I smiled. "So have you." That was the first time in 18 years he looked unsettled. With retirement came medical checkups, routine ones, required ones. He insisted we go together. The waiting room was quiet, filled with couples holding hands, whispering reassurances. I sat beside him, our knees almost touching. Almost. The doctor asked the usual questions: diet, exercise, sleep. Then he asked something unexpected. "How's your intimacy?" The word landed like a dropped glass. My husband answered before I could. "Stable," he said. The doctor looked at me. "And you?" For the first time in nearly 2 decades, someone had asked me directly. I opened my mouth and hesitated, because in that moment I realized something terrifying. If I told the truth, I would expose him. If I lied, I would protect him. And I didn't know anymore which choice scared me more. I glanced at my husband. He wasn't looking at the doctor. He was watching me, not with confidence, but with calculation, as if this tiny, ordinary question had introduced a variable he hadn't planned for. I felt it then, a hairline fracture, a crack in 18 years of perfect control, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever I said next would change everything. "I wouldn't call it stable," I said quietly. The room changed temperature, not literally, but emotionally, the way it does when truth enters a space that's been built on avoidance. The doctor glanced between us, sensing tension without understanding its history. My husband's posture stiffened just slightly. Anyone else would have missed it. I didn't. "How long has it been an issue?" the doctor asked, typing slowly now. I could feel my husband's presence beside me, still, contained, waiting. 18 years, I answered. The doctor stopped typing. He looked up at me, then at my husband, then back at me again. His expression wasn't judgmental. It was clinical concern. "That's significant," he said carefully. "Has there been counseling? Treatment? Communication?" My husband smiled, polite, practiced. "We manage our private matters privately." The doctor nodded, but his eyes stayed on me. After a pause, he said, "I'd like to speak with you alone for a moment." My husband didn't object. That should have comforted me. Instead, it terrified me. Once the door closed, the doctor leaned back slightly. "Is your marriage emotionally safe?" he asked. I laughed softly. Automatically. The way people do when the truth is too sharp. "I don't know," I said. "Is absence a form of harm?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened my file. There was something in it I hadn't seen before. A note, an old referral, a flagged comment. "Did you know," he asked gently, "that your husband consulted a specialist almost 20 years ago about emotional withdrawal as a long-term coping strategy?" My heart slammed against my ribs. "No," I whispered. "He never followed through formally," the doctor continued. "But he asked very specific questions. About duration. About outcomes. About control." Control. The word echoed. That night at home, I watched my husband move through the house with the same calm precision he always had. But now I saw it differently. Every silence, every boundary, every withheld touch, not as absence, but as intention. And for the first time in 18 years, I realized something chilling. He hadn't survived my betrayal. He had weaponized it. I didn't go looking for it. That's the part one repeat to myself whenever guilt tries to crawl back in. It was raining that afternoon, the kind of slow, persistent rain that makes the house feel smaller. My husband was out for his walk, the same route, the same duration. Retirement hadn't changed his discipline. I was searching for an old insurance document when I noticed the drawer. Locked. That alone was unusual. Our house had never needed locked drawers. Trust, after all, was our most convincing performance. I don't know why I tried the key from the spare ring, but it fit. Inside was a single folder. No labels. No color coding. Just thickness, years compressed into paper. My hand shook as I opened it. The first page was dated 18 years ago, the same month I had confessed. Notes followed. Typed. Neat. Methodical. Not a diary. A strategy. Phrases jumped out at me like wounds. Emotional withdrawal produces long-term compliance when paired with guilt. No physical punishment. No verbal abuse. Absence is cleaner. Public normalcy is essential. I sat down hard on the floor. There were timelines, milestones, predicted emotional responses. My responses. Year 1 to 3, heightened remorse, attempts at reconciliation. Year 4 to 7, normalization of deprivation. Year 8 to 12, identity erosion. Year 13 plus, dependency without resistance. I had followed his projections perfectly. There were even notes about me seeking fulfillment elsewhere, volunteering, hobbies, and instructions on how to quietly neutralize them. No anger. No confrontation. Just containment. At the back of the file was something worse. A section titled, Endgame. I couldn't breathe as I read. Retirement. Medical authority. Documentation. Ensure narrative control until natural conclusion. Natural conclusion. Death. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about erasing me slowly enough that no one would ever notice. I put the folder back exactly where it was and locked the drawer just as I heard the front door open. That evening, he sat across from me at dinner, calm as ever. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked casually. I met his eyes. For the first time in 18 years, I didn't look away. "Yes," I said, and something dark and unreadable passed over his face. Because now he knew. The air between us had always been measured, controlled. But that night, it was electric. Quiet, yes, but with an intensity one had never felt before. I placed my hands on the table, fingers trembling slightly, and met his gaze. "I know everything," I said, voice steady, though my chest felt like it might explode. He didn't flinch. Didn't raise his eyebrows. He just leaned back, the faintest hint of a smile curving his lips. "I was wondering when you'd realize," he said softly. My stomach twisted. "You planned this?" Every silence, every year, every action. He nodded. Slowly. Calmly. "Yes. But not to punish you, not really. To survive." "Survive?" I echoed, incredulous. "You've been erasing me for 18 years." He leaned forward, and for the first time I saw the man behind the calm, the strategist. A man both vulnerable and terrifying. "Not erasing you," he said. "Preserving myself. I couldn't handle betrayal. I couldn't allow it to destroy me. So I controlled it. I made it manageable. Predictable. I turned it into a system." I laughed bitterly. "A system? You call destroying our lives a system?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured at the folder on the table. "That file, yes, it's everything I documented. But it's not just about control. It's about understanding. About prevention. I wanted to make sure that neither of us broke irreparably. And in a twisted way, I succeeded." I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger, fear, and disbelief. "You succeeded? You've lived like strangers. I've lived like a ghost in my own house." He met my gaze, unwavering. "And yet here we are. Both alive. Both still standing. You survived, I survived. That's the revenge, or the lesson, depending on how you look at it." For a moment, silence stretched. Heavy, suffocating, almost sacred. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he whispered, "Do you see now why I didn't yell? Why I didn't touch you? Because once I did, it would have ended differently for both of us. I had to survive the storm, I realized then that the man I had married and betrayed was not the same man I knew. He had become a stranger, but one who had mastered patience, observation, and control to an extent I couldn't have imagined. And as I sat there, the weight of 18 years pressing down on both of us, I understood. This wasn't simple revenge. It was a lesson, one that came at the cost of our intimacy, our trust, and nearly everything else we once held sacred. 18 years of silence, 18 years of control, 18 years of living as a ghost in my own home, all came crashing down in the span of one conversation. The truth he revealed wasn't about me. It wasn't about punishment. It was about him. He had carried a secret since the night I confessed, something he never shared with anyone. Not his family. Not friends. Not even me. I have lived in fear, he admitted quietly, his voice almost breaking for the first time in all those years. Fear that I would lose myself, that I would let anger and betrayal define me. So I created a system. To survive, to keep my sanity. I stared at him, numb. All this for fear? Yes, he whispered. I feared losing you, yes, but more than that. The secret he'd held all these years wasn't something I had expected. It wasn't about control or revenge in the way I thought. It was something far more personal and far more devastating. One evening after dinner, he called me into the study. The folder from the drawer sat on the desk, closed now, as if inviting a confrontation. I walked in cautiously, heart hammering, unsure what I would find. He gestured for me to sit. His hands, usually calm and still, twitched slightly. A flicker of vulnerability broke through the mask he had perfected over nearly 2 decades. I haven't told you everything, he said quietly. About why I reacted the way I did, about why I stayed silent. I swallowed hard. Then tell me now. He took a deep breath. When you confessed, I wasn't angry in the way people expect. I was broken. The person I loved, the person I trusted, had betrayed me. I couldn't process it, not then, not ever fully. So I made a choice to survive without losing myself completely. I shook my head. And that meant this? Yes. He paused. His eyes glimmered with something I hadn't seen before: pain, remorse, fear. I became a stranger to you to protect the part of me that was still alive, to prevent myself from becoming someone cruel. I measured every word, every look, every touch to survive and to keep you alive too in your own way. And yes, I watched, studied, planned, but never out of malice. Out of fear. Fear of losing everything completely. Tears stung my eyes. So, all these years, the silence, the distance, it was fear? Not hatred. He nodded. I wanted you to live, even if it meant I had to watch from a distance. Even if it meant I couldn't touch you, couldn't comfort you, couldn't let myself break. For the first time, I understood him. Not fully, but enough to see the depth of his torment. The man I had labeled cold, calculating, cruel, had survived 18 years of silent agony, not as a punishment, but as a way to endure a betrayal he couldn't erase. I realized then that our marriage had never been about hate. It had been about survival. About two broken people trying to navigate a storm neither of us could control. And in that understanding, I felt the first spark of something fragile. Forgiveness? Perhaps. Or maybe just clarity. But one thing was certain: the past 18 years had shaped us into strangers, yes, but also survivors.